The realization did not arrive in a moment of conflict or raised voices. It came quietly, almost gently, which made it more unsettling than any argument ever could. There was no announcement, no explanation offered in advance, and no attempt to prepare me for what I was about to understand. I simply became aware, all at once, that decisions had been made without me, and that those decisions were already complete. The absence of drama made the truth sharper. It was clear that nothing I said in that moment could change what had already been decided, because the plan had never included my presence to begin with. What hurt most was not the exclusion itself, but the ease with which it was delivered. The words were spoken calmly, as if they were stating a fact that required no discussion. There was no discomfort in their tone, no hesitation that suggested doubt or regret. I found myself waiting for someone to correct the statement, to add context, or to soften the impact. That moment never came. Instead, I watched understanding pass silently between them, confirming that this was not a mistake or a misunderstanding, but a settled decision I was only now being allowed to witness. The space between us felt suddenly wider, even though no one had physically moved. I became aware of how far outside the circle I truly was, standing close enough to hear the truth, but distant enough to know it was never meant for me. The realization carried a strange calm with it, the kind that settles in when something painful finally makes sense. Pieces of past conversations, forgotten moments, and quiet dismissals began to align in my mind, revealing a pattern I had avoided naming for far too long. I understood then that my absence was not accidental. It was planned, accepted, and normalized long before I became aware of it. That knowledge reshaped how I saw every interaction that followed. The kindness I once believed in started to feel conditional. The silence I had accepted as peace revealed itself as avoidance. What I thought was belonging was exposed as convenience, granted only when it served a purpose. In that quiet moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. I stopped waiting to be included, to be acknowledged, or to be chosen. The realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. I was no longer confused about where I stood. I finally understood that I had been standing outside for much longer than I had ever allowed myself to admit. The shift from helping to being expected happened so gradually that I did not notice it at first. What began as small acts of support, moments where I stepped in because it felt natural to do so, slowly hardened into assumptions about my availability. No one ever sat me down to explain that my time no longer belonged to me. It was simply taken, folded into the family's routine as if it had always been there. I was no longer asked if I could help. I was told what needed to be done, and the language used made refusal feel inappropriate, almost disloyal. At first, I convinced myself this was normal. Families help each other, I reminded myself, and compromise is part of love. But the balance was never equal. My life bent easily to accommodate everyone else's needs, while their schedules remained fixed and protected. If something went wrong, if plans fell apart or responsibilities became inconvenient, I was the solution that required the least effort. I adjusted, rearranged, and absorbed disruptions without complaint because that was what kept the peace. Over time, peace began to feel like another word for silence. The requests multiplied quietly. Babysitting became routine, not occasional. Errands appeared without warning, attached to expectations rather than gratitude. Decisions about my availability were made in conversations where I was not present, then handed to me as facts instead of questions. My calendar lost its meaning because it could be rewritten at any moment. The assumption was clear. My time was flexible because my life was seen as less important, less full, less deserving of protection. What made it harder to challenge was the way these expectations were framed. Everything was presented as temporary, reasonable, or necessary. I was reminded of family loyalty, of sacrifices others had made, of how much worse things could be. Any hesitation on my part was met with subtle disappointment, not anger, which made it harder to defend myself without feeling guilty. I was not accused outright, but I was made to feel selfish for wanting space, rest, or autonomy. Slowly, My identity within the family narrowed. I was no longer seen as an individual with goals, limits, or needs of my own. I became a function, a resource to be used when circumstances demanded it. My presence was valued for what it could provide, not for who I was. The more reliable I became, the more invisible my boundaries grew. It was assumed I would always step in, always adapt, always make room. The emotional toll of this realization settled in quietly. I began to feel resentment I could not express and exhaustion I could not justify. Saying yes no longer felt generous. It felt compulsory. Even moments of rest carried anxiety, as if I were waiting for the next interruption. The idea of refusing filled me with fear, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I knew how quickly the family's calm could turn into disapproval. Eventually, I understood that being treated as the backup plan meant I was never part of the main picture. My role existed to prevent inconvenience for others, not to create a life of my own. The help I offered had stopped being appreciated and started being expected, and that expectation erased my right to choose. Realizing this did not come with immediate action or confrontation, but it planted a truth I could no longer ignore. Helping should be an act of care, freely given, not a debt that binds you. When help becomes obligation, it stops being love and starts becoming control. And once that line is crossed, the cost is paid quietly by the one who is always expected to bend. The moment I refused did not come from anger or impulse. It came from exhaustion built slowly over years of unspoken expectations and quiet compliance. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations. I simply said no. And in that single word, the entire structure I had been living inside began to crack. The refusal was calm, measured, and deliberate, which made it more disruptive than any emotional outburst could have been. It interrupted a pattern that everyone else had come to depend on without ever questioning. For a long time, control had existed in subtle forms. It did not announce itself through commands or threats, but through assumptions that shaped my behavior before I even realized choices were being made for me. Plans appeared fully formed, responsibilities assigned without discussion, and my agreement was treated as guaranteed. Silence was mistaken for consent, and compliance was interpreted as loyalty. By the time I recognized what was happening, the expectation that I would cooperate had already been woven into the family's rhythm. Saying no felt like breaking an unspoken rule. The air in the room shifted immediately, not because of shouting or confrontation, but because something familiar had been disrupted. I could see it in their expressions, in the pause that followed, in the way calm turned into controlled disbelief. My refusal was not received as a personal boundary, but as a violation of order. It challenged a system that relied on my predictability and my willingness to adapt without resistance. What followed was not chaos, but pressure. I was reminded of family duty, of past support, of how things were supposed to work. The language was gentle, but the message was firm. My role was not optional. The control revealed itself in these moments, not through force, but through guilt carefully disguised as responsibility. The expectation was that I would retreat, apologize, and restore the balance by giving in, as I always had before. Instead, I stayed steady. I repeated my refusal without justification or explanation. I did not argue or defend myself, because I understood that doing so would turn my boundary into a negotiation. That was when the reaction changed. Calm expressions tightened, patience thinned, and the quiet disapproval became impossible to ignore. The refusal exposed how conditional their acceptance had been. As long as I complied, harmony existed. The moment I asserted myself, that harmony dissolved. In that space, I realized how much power had been taken from me through silence. My willingness to avoid conflict had allowed others to decide what I owed them. Saying no was not just about rejecting a single demand. It was about reclaiming my right to choose. It forced everyone to confront a reality they had avoided. I was not obligated to sacrifice my autonomy to maintain their comfort. The aftermath was uncomfortable and emotionally heavy. I felt the weight of disapproval settle around me, and I understood that refusing meant losing the version of connection I had known. Yet beneath the discomfort was clarity. For the first time, I could see the dynamic for what it truly was. Control had depended on my participation, and by refusing, I had removed the foundation it stood on. That single no did not fix everything, and it did not bring immediate peace. What it did bring was truth. It marked the moment I stopped being managed and started standing on my own terms. The refusal changed everything because it ended a long silence that had protected control for years. In choosing to speak, I accepted the consequences, but I also gained something far more valuable than approval. I gained myself. The truth did not arrive all at once, and it did not announce itself as something dramatic or explosive. It surfaced quietly, in fragments, through moments that felt ordinary until they were not. I was not searching for answers or trying to expose anyone. In fact, part of me believed that not knowing was safer. But once the first piece revealed itself, it became impossible to turn away. And what I discovered could not be unseen. It began with small details that did not belong together. Messages that felt carefully worded. Schedules that did not align. Transactions that raised questions without providing explanations. None of it was obvious enough to confront immediately. Yet all of it carried a strange weight. The more I noticed, the more aware I became that something had been deliberately kept out of my reach. These were not innocent oversights. They were fragments of a reality that existed alongside mine, hidden by design. As I moved slowly through what had been left accessible, I felt a growing sense of unease. Every piece of information confirmed that conversations had taken place without me. Decisions had been made behind closed doors, and narratives had been shaped to keep me uninformed. I realized that my role in the family had never included full transparency. I had been trusted to carry responsibilities, but not truth. That distinction was painful to accept. The most unsettling part was not what I found, but how long it had been happening. The evidence suggested patterns, not isolated incidents. This was not a single mistake or moment of poor judgment. It was a sustained effort to control information, to decide what I was allowed to know and when. The realization reshaped my understanding of past interactions. What I once believed were acts of protection now looked like deliberate omissions. What I thought was care revealed itself as control through silence. As the picture became clearer, I felt an unexpected calm settle in. There was sadness, disappointment, and a deep sense of betrayal. But there was also clarity. The confusion I had carried for years finally had a source. I understood why conversations felt incomplete, why explanations were vague, and why questions were often redirected instead of answered. The truth explained the distance I had always felt but could never name. I did not confront anyone immediately. I needed time to process what I was holding, to understand the weight of it and the consequences of acknowledging it. Knowing the truth meant accepting that the version of family I believed in had never fully existed. It meant recognizing that trust had been conditional and information had been used as a tool to maintain balance at my expense. When I finally looked at the people involved, I saw them differently. Their calm expressions no longer felt reassuring. Their reassurances no longer carried meaning. I could see the effort it took to maintain the illusion, and I understood that my silence had made it easier for them to continue. The truth was never meant for me to see because it threatened a structure that relied on my compliance. Uncovering the truth changed my position forever. I was no longer simply reacting to what I was told. I was aware of what had been hidden, and that awareness carried responsibility. I could not return to ignorance, and I could not pretend that trust remained intact. The knowledge I gained did not empower me through strength or certainty. It empowered me through honesty. In discovering what was kept from me, I lost something I could never recover, but I also gained something essential. I gained the ability to see clearly. The truth, once revealed, did not offer comfort or closure. It offered reality. And reality, no matter how painful, became the foundation on which I could finally stand without being manipulated by what I was never meant to know. Choosing honesty was not an act of courage in the way people often imagine it. It did not feel powerful or liberating at first. It felt heavy, isolating, and deeply uncomfortable. Silence had always been presented as the safer option, the one that kept the family intact and protected everyone from conflict. For years, I had been taught, both directly and indirectly, that speaking the truth would only create damage. Yet the longer I stayed silent, the more I realized that the damage was already happening, just quietly and without accountability. Silence had become a shared agreement, even if no one ever named it. Problems were acknowledged only in private, then hidden in public. Excuses replaced explanations, and calm expressions masked unresolved truths. The family functioned on the surface because no one challenged what lived underneath. I was expected to participate in this performance, to look away when something felt wrong, and to accept partial truths as complete ones. Over time, that silence became suffocating. It demanded my cooperation while denying me honesty in return. When I finally chose to speak, it was not driven by a desire to punish or expose. It came from the realization that protecting lies required constant self-erasure. Every time I stayed quiet, I was choosing comfort for others at the expense of my own integrity. The truth I held was not mine to fix or soften. Carrying it in silence had already cost me my sense of self, and continuing to do so would only deepen the damage. Breaking that silence fractured the illusion of unity that had been carefully maintained. The family had relied on avoidance to preserve stability, and honesty threatened that balance immediately. Reactions were controlled but tense, filled with deflection and justifications that framed truth as betrayal. I was accused of disrupting peace, of making things worse than they needed to be. What no one acknowledged was that the peace they defended had been built on deception, and deception cannot survive in the presence of truth. The lies were not always loud or dramatic. They lived in omissions, half-explanations, and carefully chosen narratives that protected certain people while sacrificing others. I began to see how these lies shaped relationships, distorted accountability, and allowed harmful behavior to continue without consequence. The family was not broken by honesty. It had been broken long before, held together only by silence and shared denial. Speaking the truth changed how everyone saw me. I was no longer convenient or predictable. I became a reminder of what they wanted to forget. Conversations grew colder. Distance replaced familiarity, and the comfort of belonging disappeared. Yet even in that loss, there was clarity. I understood that acceptance had always been conditional. As long as I helped maintain the lie, I belonged. The moment I refused, I became a problem. Honesty forced each person to confront their role, whether through action or inaction. Some chose to justify themselves. Others retreated into silence, even deeper than before. No one stepped forward to take responsibility in the way I had once hoped. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing. It confirmed that the burden I had been carrying was never mine alone, and it was never fair for me to hold it. Breaking a family built on lies does not feel like victory. It feels like loss layered with truth. There were no dramatic resolutions, no apologies that repaired what had been damaged, and no return to normal. What remained was a quieter, more honest reality where I no longer had to betray myself to protect others. Choosing honesty meant accepting the collapse of something that was never truly solid. In letting it fall, I did not destroy my family. I stopped pretending that silence was love and finally allowed truth to take its place. Walking away was not a sudden decision. It did not come from anger or rebellion. It came from a long, quiet accumulation of understanding that my presence had been treated as optional, my efforts taken for granted, and my boundaries repeatedly ignored. For years, I had adjusted, accommodated, and sacrificed, believing that this was the way family worked. That love required flexibility, patience, and compromise. But over time, I realized that the compromise was one-sided, that the sacrifices were never recognized, and that my own sense of self had been quietly eroded by expectations I never agreed to. Walking away became less about punishment and more about survival. Boundaries, I learned, are not negotiable when others have consistently ignored them. My time, my energy, and my emotional labor had been treated as resources to be used whenever convenient. And silence had been expected as my only response. By the time I recognized the pattern, the cost of continued compliance was clear. The more I gave, the less I was seen as a person with needs of my own. Walking away was the act of reclaiming what had been stripped from me without ceremony or acknowledgement. It was the first real affirmation that my life belonged to me, not to anyone else's convenience. The act of leaving was quiet. There was no confrontation, no dramatics, and no opportunity for anyone to manipulate my decision into guilt. I did not storm out of the house or raise my voice. I simply stepped back and created space between myself and a system that had relied on my availability, obedience, and silence. That space was necessary for clarity, for reflection, and for the emotional distance that allowed me to see my situation objectively. The physical act of leaving mirrored the emotional separation I had been cultivating internally for months. Every mile, every closed door, every moment spent alone reinforced my understanding that self-respect required distance. Distance was not about abandonment. It was about protection. It was about removing myself from patterns that had conditioned me to prioritize others' needs over my own well-being. In that distance, I could finally acknowledge the cumulative effect of years of quiet expectation, exhaustion, frustration, resentment, and a deep, unspoken loss of identity. Removing myself from constant interference allowed me to hear my own thoughts, recognize my own priorities, and rediscover the boundaries I had long ignored. It was in this space that self-respect began to take root again, small but undeniable, growing stronger with each day I chose not to compromise my principles. Walking away also meant observing without interference. I watched from a distance as the family confronted, adapted, or suffered the consequences of choices they had previously insulated me from. I did not need to intervene, soften, or protect. I had spent too long absorbing the responsibility for other people's actions, and I learned that stepping back does not equate to abandoning humanity. It equates to preserving it. In leaving, I discovered that my role in the family need not define my worth, and that protecting my boundaries was not selfish, it was necessary. The realization that survival sometimes requires leaving quietly, firmly, and without apology was transformative. It did not bring closure in the traditional sense. It did not repair broken dynamics or guarantee reconciliation. What it did provide was clarity, freedom, and the ability to reclaim a life lived intentionally rather than reactively. Walking away became an act of self-preservation, a declaration that I would no longer participate in systems designed to drain me. It was proof that respect, both given and received, cannot thrive in an environment where silence is expected and boundaries are ignored. In stepping away, I found the most important truth. Self-respect is non-negotiable, and distance is sometimes the only way to maintain it. Love, loyalty, and family ties do not require self-destruction. Survival is not betrayal. It is honesty with oneself. Walking away was the culmination of years of quiet realizations, small refusals, and steady observation. It was not dramatic, but it was profound, and it marked the first time in my life that I chose myself over expectations, over convenience, and over silent control. In that choice, I found a kind of freedom that words cannot fully capture, a quiet victory that belongs entirely to me.